Hey, welcome back, everyone. We'll start this session. So we're moving things around a little bit. If anybody is looking at the schedule, you should kind of just put that aside for the moment. We're now going to go to the presentation on the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework and other related topics. We'll begin this by introducing Dr. Greg Scott from the UN Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. He is managing the Secretariat in the UN in New York. Many of you know him already, but for those of you who don't, he's a familiar face to those of us who have been working in the space of coming up with a new framework to help national mapping agencies, national geospatial agencies, and national statistical offices in addressing their future geospatial information needs. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Greg, please.
Thank you, Tim, and greetings again, everyone, both in the room and around the world. So I'm going to focus a little bit more, as I mentioned yesterday in the keynote, into the IGIF in some detail, and my colleague Tio Chi Hai will also provide some inputs as well when we get into some more of the detail. I'm also conscious that I know a number of you may have heard the presentation yesterday, so I don't want to duplicate any of that too much, but at the same time, also aware that there may be participants, both physically and virtually, that may not have been at the keynote presentation yesterday. So I will quickly provide a quick veneer of information that may just duplicate a little bit from yesterday. So we've been talking this morning, and it's been a great discussion around this transition or transformation of national mapping, national geospatial, national statistical organizations in the geospatial context. And that transition has also been around the transition from national spatial data infrastructures also to the IGIF. And so I'll touch on some of those different elements in this presentation, and hopefully as we get to some of the detail that my colleague Tio will refer to, you may see some of the subtle differences there to some degree. What I wanted to do first, and this was sort of a question that I was thinking about this morning when Tim was talking about transformation. And often we get questions around, well, what do we mean when we say transformation of agencies? And so what I've just done here is pull two key paragraphs out of the IGIF overarching strategy. Not a single word has been changed, but I guess it kind of alludes to, not when you think about some of these guidances, is that we need to look at definitions and terms to a certain degree. And so in the IGIF, when we talk about transformation, this is really what it is. And it's sort of in two parts. One is about this technology transformation around the economies and services and government, etc., and how that helps citizens at all levels, and using technology to be able to do that and to help assist decision making, and, as we say, to take practical actions to achieve digital transformation, and how we do that for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So that's a transformative nature of technology and enabling. The other part too is in the IGIF, when it looks at the drivers for change, one of those is transforming government in particular, and looking at how it enables integration of data, of transparency, of decision making, and also reducing costs to government, and having more accountability, transparency within government as well. So being about more effective, more agile, and more citizen-centric, if we can call it that, when we think about the data supply chain. So I just thought it would be useful that those are the terminologies that we've used when we think about transformation. I won't go into this in any detail, but as I mentioned yesterday, we've made a close coupling between the global development agendas and global geospatial frameworks. And the IGIF is that that umbrella framework that we now use and leverage in terms of assisting countries to bridge the geospatial digital divide and to strengthen their national mapping and their national geospatial arrangements within their countries. And as I mentioned, we'll get down into specific country examples of how that's taking place in this next little while. Another key element, I guess, is around the words there, developing and strengthening. It, in some instances, it could be starting from scratch, but it's really about how do we make things better? How do we assist countries? How do we ensure that they have a much better opportunity to contribute to socio-economic prosperity and environmental development? So, and with that focus of developing countries. I mentioned also yesterday some of the reasons as to why the IGIF was needed, and part of that is that transformation. As I've just mentioned, we keep talking about transformation, and it can be meant in many different ways, but also the lack of awareness of the role, as I kind of mentioned with Claire Hadley's wonderful presentation this morning. There's a lack of awareness of what cartography, mapping, geospatial, other data can do once it's been realized and used to its fullest potential. Importantly, the IGIF is a framework. It's not an infrastructure. It's not an SDI or an NSDI. It really does focus on geospatial information and that keyword integration, particularly with other meaningful data to solve problems. So it's a very holistic approach to how we tackle problems. So it's really about applying problems and applying solutions to problems rather than the other way, where it's a solution looking for a problem. And it's very much about being in that framework context, independent of infrastructures or independent of what particular unique circumstance countries may have with their national data infrastructures, etc. But in saying that, the IGIF builds directly upon previous efforts in SDIs and NSDIs. So it's more of we term it that umbrella framework. So it builds upon that. And the way that it does it is, for example, is that many SDIs or NSDIs are developed, and I guess in often a non-uniform way in different countries. I know in the past we had, for example, with the Global Spatial Data Infrastructure Association, GSDI, when they had the cookbook, you may remember. That cookbook provided a lot of guidance in developing SDIs, but as technology and web services and all of these different aspects changed, the role and relevance and applicability of SDIs also changed. So it wasn't such a structured way of building and defining SDIs in terms of when we think about the architecture itself. That's changed quite a lot, whether it's hardware, software, solutions, applications, etc. So now it's very different. And what the IGIF does, it kind of builds, we term it additional structure, reasoning, and evidence as to why NSDIs are important. But in doing so, it then goes to the further steps of providing the guidance, the options, and the actions to actually go and do just that. So we'll work through some of that in our presentation this morning. So I think that's really important. People say, what's the difference? The difference is really the fact that one's a framework that gives you guidance, whereas the other is actually the build in itself. It has three parts, as we mentioned yesterday. It's a very complex series of pieces in the IGIF. At the highest level, it has a strategic framework, it has an implementation guide, and it has country level action plans. And I will go through the framework, the part one, why geospatial information is critical, some delving into part 2, the implementation guide, what that means, what your options are, what your guidance may be. And then Tio will go into the actions themselves within a country. So how do you do this? When do you do this? And who does this? And so each of those cascade down. Part 1 cascades into part 2, which cascades into part 3. And hopefully that will make sense by the time we get to the end of our discussion today. So starting at the top, part 1, which is the overarching framework itself. As I mentioned yesterday, it starts off with a very high-level strategy, a one-page strategy, in the first half of it here. And I'm just going to go through each of those different parts in a little bit of detail, thinking through what each of those means. First of all, the vision and the mission. So these are key elements to what we're trying to do here. The vision, recognizing that we need to plan for better future generations, and a collective aspiration to leave no one behind. And the mission is really, how do we get there? The aspirational goals to get there, to bridge this geospatial digital divide, to find sustainable solutions for socio-economic and environmental development, to influence inclusive and transformative societal change for everyone, and according to national needs and national circumstances. Now, importantly, what I want to just emphasize now is that as I go through the strategy and the implementation guide, these are language and words and paragraphs that are available for countries to then use. So this vision and mission is a vision and mission of the IGIF itself. But then countries can then choose to take that vision and mission, just as they can with other elements of the strategy, and refine them and define them for their own countries. And Tio will give you an example of that for Mongolia, where they've literally picked up the vision and the mission and they've articulated it to their national needs. But really important for a lot of countries, particularly developing countries around the world, is often they just don't have the right language to use, the right wording that's in decision maker or policy or political language. The IGIF provides all of that consistency in language to help them to do that. So whilst it provides a lot of guidance, it actually provides words of that can have a strong influence in putting a strategy and a bid to governments for what they need to be doing. I mentioned yesterday the strategic drivers, and they are from global to very local, such as the 2030 agenda itself, right down to national programs, national priorities, national needs, whether they be around infrastructure or transport or housing or education or health or other welfare areas, or around the environment, or, for example, in many small island developing states, it will be around the oceans, around sea level rise, around tourism and sustainable management of their land and food resources, etc., etc. Every country has a very different and unique need in terms of their own strategic drivers. And they're very important to recognize. Transformation is another key part of that as well. And more, we are seeing countries, as has been mentioned already today, hooking into the digital transformation agenda. The fact that we are becoming more ubiquitous with our use of data and technology, and the fact that governments need to be able to recognize that and be able to play a role determining what that may look like in their national economies. The IGIF has 7 underpinning principles, and these are what we term as the key characteristics and values that provide us a compass for implementing the framework. In other words, if we are able to abide by these underpinning principles, which are general in nature, but in the actual guide become very, very specific, it means that countries can tailor to their needs. It's about being able to have a strategic enablement in terms of the political and financial support, being transparent and accountable so that citizens have access to information and resources, reliable, accessible, and easily used. principles we're very, very familiar with in our community, but more also about being more collaborative, more cooperation, more coordination, and thinking about integrative solutions rather than single purpose solutions, being sustained and valued in terms of being able to ensure that the long term is a benefit rather than just the short term. And Principle 7 is probably the most important of all, leadership and commitment. And we talk about in the IGIF that with leadership, you can make substantial and even monumental change, but with lack of leadership, you make no change. So they're just the 7 underpinning principles that we go into a bit of detail on that countries can use. We have 8 goals, and these are the aspiration. This is part of that mission. The goals are about that future state. Where do we want to be? Not where we are today, but where do we want to be in terms of countries having the capacity and the skills to manage their geospatial information and to advance policy and decision-making capabilities at all levels. So the most obvious is effective geospatial information management. We're very good at that. But also, in many countries around the world, it's about leveraging international cooperation and partnerships as well, across many, many different areas, many sectors, and breadths of what they look like. Increasing our capacity and capability, having integrated geospatial information systems and services. It's a bit like the discussion with Claire this morning, is where did that processing take place? It doesn't really matter. And we're seeing more and more in the world where software as a service, where cloud compute, where a lot of analytical capability is now being off-sited or offshored. Now, that needs to be managed, sure. But the point is that this integration and this globalization of data and information and technology is also growing at a rapid rate. And it's been diversified in so many different ways that we don't necessarily have a really good hook as to what that means nowadays. But to a point, we don't necessarily need to either, as long as there's good, transparent accountability in how that takes place. Things like an economic return on investment is critically important. So what's that value proposition? Being sustained in terms of our education and training and our future. And as we said all the time, we keep saying communication, engagement, communication, communication, communication. And at the end of the day, it's about bringing value and benefit. This is the 9 strategic pathways, which I'll delve into a little bit. And these 9 strategic pathways is where the strategy, part 1, then starts crossing over into the implementation guide, part 2. So it's the 9 strategic pathways that are chapters of the implementation guide. Let me just talk through that over the next few minutes. So importantly, before we get to that, I just want to mention benefits. I talked a lot about benefits yesterday, and from an economist's view of the world or a financier's view of the world, they say, well, why do I invest in geospatial in government? And there's a number of ways of doing this. Firstly, there's societal benefits, public good, and all of those different aspects. But there's also thematic benefits as well when we think about the different sectors. And often those economic benefits are not a dollar tangible number. Often those economic benefits are to the society and good and even nationalism to a certain degree, to ensure that we have indigenous capability, for example. And it's very much about how that supports our economic growth within our countries. And as I showed yesterday in a more simple way, is examples of those different sectors and use cases and investments that may take place within and across countries. And as I mentioned, as I keep coming back to, Tio will give an example of this in his presentation, of where all of these different pieces, and I know they look really complex, but they really do come together pretty logically when you get down to it. The 9 strategic pathways have 3 areas of influence around governance, technology, and people. Those pathways which have been now developed 4 years ago, we've opened those pathways up to global consultation and rigor. We workshop this with 133 countries around the world in 15 international workshops over 18 months. And we took in another 70 written submissions on what's within these pathways, and they've held true over the last 4 years. We made, really, I would term as one minor modification. We switched legal and policy to policy and legal, because one, in a way, comes before the other. And other than that, those strategic pathways have held true across the last 4 years of the IGIF, which is really, really pleasing. That then gets broken down into what we term as our key elements. Would have seen just in the strategy here, up here, where you've got the 9 pathways, and vertically you can see key elements around things like governance, model, leadership, and that. So it's a bit easier to read those key elements as we have here. So this is just another way of showing those key elements across each of those pathways. So what we have is 4 key elements for each strategic pathway, and those 4 key elements are main areas of each of the implementation guide. Okay, now I'm going to hit you with a slide that you do not read, okay? Because from those 4 key elements, we then break it down across each chapter into a whole number of actions. So this gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And so you can see here also, and the main message here is, and I'll walk you through an example of this, is the consistency in the structure. So what you see here is the 9 strategic pathways, and then you see the overview diagram for each chapter of those 9 strategic pathways. And that chapter breaks down into more and more detail, and I'll walk you through one chapter. But there's also an extra chapter as well called Solving the Puzzle, and I'll get to that shortly too. So as we look at that, that's the crossover now into the implementation guide part 2. So part 1 was why we're doing what we do, why geospatial is important. Part 2 is what do we do? What is the guidance and the actions that's being provided? And so this is just a bit of an overview of that. As I said, this is the what of the guidance. And it's very much guidance. It's not kind of like the old GSDI cookbook where you start at the top, work all your way all the way through. It's guidance. It says you might want to do this, or you might want to do that. Depending on your circumstances, you might take that option, or you might take this option. And what we've tried to do is provide all of those options for all circumstances across countries, because every country is different. So how countries in Europe might think about this is very different to how countries in some of them, the least developed countries, may apply it. Very different. So it gives you those options starting from ground zero to almost saying, well, I just need to tweak my national arrangements. So it provides all of that guidance. And as we say there, every country is at different levels of maturity in their geospatial journey. So this guidance is comprehensive yet general enough to be applicable to all countries. This is an example of the structure for each of those chapters. And I'm using Strategic Pathway 1 here. You can see the pathway, governance and institutions, the 4 key elements, and then the 11 different subsections within each of those chapters. And it's exactly the same in every single chapter, so it's uniform. And within that, as I mentioned, the overarching diagram, it has a lot of repeat there so that people can use this information, say, on a flyer or something very quick if they want to brief their minister. They say, well, when you're talking about this, what do you mean? Well, this is about our governance model. You know, as leadership, we need to do this. Okay, what does that mean? Well, these are our principles. This is the sort of things we do. So it has different areas of applicability in there, and it has different tools and interrelated actions that are made available throughout the chapters and different appendices. So each of those different mechanisms are provided not only in I guess, a structured way, but in different ways, where here we've changed the diagram and thinking around the idea of a wagon wheel, where we look at what the principles may be for the chapter, what the actions and interrelated actions are, etc., right through to outcomes. And another way of looking at it is around different means here in terms of exactly what those actions are. And then it goes through the entire chapter, breaking those down into a high level of detail. So at the moment, the implementation guide, which is on our website, is literally a series of PDF documents, significant PDF documents. But our intent with these is to basically make them a web-based suite of tools or documents where you have hyperlinks on different areas and you connect all of this up. So you don't have to scroll through individual pages to get to a specific action, for example. You can just go in, say, into say this, you're saying, I want to set my directions. I want to look at something like, okay, what's my ICT needs? And you can just go straight to that, for example. So we're looking at making it an interactive suite of tools once we finalize all of the inputs into this. I mentioned a separate chapter we've called Solving the Puzzle. And this is really a chapter that countries asked us to put in additionally on understanding the IGIF implementation guide. So it's a chapter that explains all the background, the context, and actually how to use that guide and what different pieces mean. And it goes into a lot of detail on how to do that. But really importantly, right at the very, very start of that solving the puzzle, it talks about this relationship between the IGIF and NSDIs. And this is in the introduction. I just wanted to read out some key words here around many countries continue to face a series of impediments that exacerbate their ability and opportunity. We talk about opportunity and access, I mentioned yesterday, to participate fully in transformational change with geospatial information capabilities. Yet this change is essential to support national development, economic prosperity, and through that, a global and thriving information economy. Many countries will need to bridge the geospatial digital divide. And that the irony is that the countries that need this most are the countries that have the least ability to implement some of this. And this is why this guide was developed. On the other page, it talks about the IGIF not being an infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier, and what it does. And it goes into more detail around those concepts on the IGIF and the NSDI, and thinking about transformation, the fourth industrial revolution, the data revolution, all those different aspects. And all of that's in that solving the puzzle. This is all online too, I might add. So that's really important in terms of articulating some of that difference to a certain degree. Now, part 3 is a very, very different beast, if I can call it that. You can see that part 1, the overarching strategy, is only 26 odd pages. It's in a document you can carry around, and it's very, very high level. The implementation guide is 10 chapters and many appendices. If you wanted to carry it around in your suitcase, you're probably looking at about 1,000+ pages, but that's not the intent. It's about it being a digital resource. But in old terms, if we're talking paper and pencils, that's what it would be in paper. Part 3, the country level action plans, is a series of resources, templates, tools, pro formas, if I can call it that countries then use as a starting point. So country level action plans are developed by countries, but we've also got pro formas that they can use if they wish to do so. And this has proven really, really valuable because countries do things in their own ways. I know we like to be uniform. No, we don't. We like to do things our own way sometimes, and many countries do that. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to let Tio come in now and talk about these country level action plans and give some explicit examples. But whilst we swap over, we could take some questions, Tim, just while we do a swap over, if that works.
That's fine.
Okay.
I think that's great. So I'm sure that folks have some questions about what Greg has provided, because this is very comprehensive. There's a lot of information here. I'm sure you have questions about how this works and how it may impact you. So let's first go to the room. Are there questions for Greg?
And if not, that's fine too.
Yep. So let's go online. Are there any questions for our folks online for Greg? Okay, I think that then what we'll do is we'll just move on to the next phase of this. Oh, Mark's got a question. No, it's got to be on the mic because otherwise they won't hear.
Thank you, Tim. Yep. Test. Yep. All right. Yeah, there we go. So as you've taken the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework Part 2 and actually started to take it to the countries so they can develop the Part 3, what kind of feedback are you getting back from the countries? Are they happy with Part 2? Are there changes they want to see in that?
Really good question. And the simple answer to that is no. Now, let me explain why. And we didn't see this coming. We sort of fell into a lucky position, and that was that during 2018-19, we had the opportunity. Normally what we do is we develop some sort of framework or guidance, and then we go into a global consultation. That's how the UN does things. You know, you develop this with a number of countries, you go into a global consultation, and then through that you get feedback. What we did from right at the outset, because this was such a big change, so very, very quickly, like in 5 months, we developed the overarching strategy, and it was adopted by UN GGIM. And then we said, okay, we're going to go away and now develop the implementation guide. And we think it'll take a year, and it didn't. It took twice that. It took 2 years. But what we did was, as I mentioned, we literally workshopped with 133 countries. That's a lot. 15 workshops, all regions of the world, in all major languages. And through that, we kind of, all that was required fell out because the consultation happened right at the start. And as a subsequent great outcome of that was that we got ownership, we got buy-in. And so we did 4 workshops in Africa, for example, and they really changed a lot of our thinking. Just by what they needed, changed a lot of how we went about things and some of those understandings. So that by the time we got to the final product, it was more editing, if I could call it that. And it'll never be perfect, but in terms of its substance, no, it's kind of standing pretty true. But I think it was an outcome of 18 months of workshopping with different countries around the world, getting their engagement, taking on board their views and their comments, and the fact that they then own it was really, really critical, I think. And that was, for us, that was just luck. It wasn't something we had intended. So we did go to the consultation, but by then it was really just a review process.
I would actually argue with you that it wasn't by luck. You guys did that systematically. I was involved in the process, and by the time we got it as part of the UN Geospatial Societies, it had been pretty well thought through. We were just doing editing and
Yep.
things. So no, I think it was very intentional. I'm glad to hear the result. That's good.
Thank
Stood
you.
the test of time.
I'd like to add a footnote, though, to your question. And that is that, because you're asking about how countries, if you've gotten comments about it. As you listen to Tio's presentation on the country level action plan, one thing that we emphasized to the 6 countries that we were working with to try to begin building that process is that we emphasize the existence of the resource, the value of the resource, and how it could be used to help them develop their own story. So it provided its own framework for them, and they literally were able to copy and paste some of the portions that were coming from the implementation guide right into their country level action plan because the work was already done. The justification or the rationale or the whatever it may have been. It wasn't used, they didn't take 1,000 pages and put it into their country level action plan because that would be silly. But they did take a line here or a paragraph there, and that became the base. And we encourage them to do that because use what's there, save yourself some time, don't think too hard on this, move on to the next phase. So it did have that impact. Any other questions before we go to Tio? Just have to talk. All right, at this time, I'm going to introduce Tio Chihai from the UN Secretariat. So Greg and Tio are like the dynamic duo. Everything GGIM, everything IGIF, everything related to any of that stuff is done for the most part by these 2 individuals with obviously some support. But these are the guys that are formulating all these ideas and seeing them through. So Tio is a great person to work with, and turn it over to him. Go, Tio, go.
Thank you, Tim. It's good to be here. I was wondering when you say, well, you hardly get 2 of us or 3 of us together in the same room. Which is true. This is, and I appreciate it. Yeah, let me just go through on part 3, but it will, like Greg says, part 3 do not have the structure or the documentation that you're seeing in part 1 or part 2. It has a lot of resources. It contains a lot of templates. It is where the country comes in, right? This is where the country comes in. Part 1 and part 2 is there because countries prepare, they design, they develop, they prepare their own country level action plan. Very importantly, it must align to their national priorities and national circumstances. That, if you go through the implementation guidance, it is there. You need to consider when you develop your action plan, implement the IGIF, you need to consider your situation, your context, your circumstances, and very importantly, what are your national priorities? Now, many of you will very quickly say, hang on. Depending on which government I get, I will have different national priorities. True. Therefore, your action plan needs to be agile. And if you look at that diagram, there is a series of elements that you have to go through, and you need to actually put in place a mechanism for you to continue to view and to update your action plan. It has to be also, in our jargon, a living document. So if you could see there that these are the elements. Now, colleagues, I will say this up front. Look at these elements. This is not the element. Oh, my action plan must have all this. If it's one element is missing, it is no longer an action plan. No. Country determine what is the action plan. We are suggesting that it contains these elements. It may contain 2 more elements. It may contain 2 less elements. Now, it's according to your national circumstances. By and large, as what Tim was saying, we have been working with a number of countries, and they have been incredibly gracious. They are teaching us a lot. And we have found that these are, by and large, the elements that country coalesce around. Right? You need a background, you need a rationale. This is where we hear. There are words in part 1, the strategic framework. There are paragraphs in the implementation guide, cut and paste. That's how they do. Depending on their national context, they develop their own background, their rationale, what is their value proposition, what resonates with their policy and decision makers. Develop a vision, a mission and goal. A lot of countries or geospatial agencies already have them. What are the approaches? How do we align strategically with our national priorities? And it goes around. We need to know what are the resources we need, not just in human resources, but also in financial resources. How do we go about coming to a realistic estimate and to move forward? Now, the action plan references the specific guidance, the options, and the recommendations in the implementation guide. So Greg just mentioned in the implementation guide, if you print it all out, it's a volume. That is your guidance. You go through that for you to actually help you to develop action plans. Countries will actually, depending on your priorities again, can start at different parts. You don't have to always start at solving the puzzle. Go to pathway 1 and then go through. Depending, you do an analysis, you come out with an approach to develop your action plan. I'll come to that later. Now, we mentioned about countries. We were thankful that in the United Nations, we are able to access some resources. And we have a development account. And for that 11 account project, we work with 6 countries. Now, the 6 countries are selected not randomly. Obviously, there are some context to it. But if you would look at them, 2 are essentially small island developing states. 2 are landlocked developing countries with a significant challenge dealing with disasters. And 2 are least developed countries. So we went to these 6. We partner with them, and it's a 2-way process. As much as we work with them, they also work with us. And back to also the implementation guidance and a number of the resources that we have developed. We benefited, the United Nations and our global community benefited a lot from these 6 countries' experience. They were let's call them the proper word is they are piloting. They help us to pilot, but they also realize that they are the guinea pigs. So they are the first, and through the process, we do a lot of refinement of our thinking and our approaches. So if you could see in this very busy slide, we got part 1, part 2. We quickly realized when we went to country, we need an approach to help countries to move from the overarching strategic framework, the implementation guide with all the guidance, all the options. There's a lot of resource in there, a lot of knowledge being contributed in there. And how do we actually then prepare a country level action plan? So we have to come up with a way of helping countries to what we term as doing an assessment analysis. This is where they understand their national situation, their circumstances, and their national priorities. United Nations, we then put into that process a capacity development element to it. So while we are supporting the countries in assessing and analyzing, their capacity and their capability is developed at the same time. It is a self-pace. You determine your own schedule, your time depends on the resources you have. You are learning and discovering on your own, right? As you design and develop this country level action plan. And it goes through a number of phases. Initially there is a planning and preparation, then have a plan of action. That plan is to how you're going to develop your country level action plan. What is going to happen when? And then you go through a period where you're doing a lot of assessing and analyzing. That includes with your stakeholders. And so I was talking to some colleagues from UAE, they have stakeholders, they have they bring the private sector, the universities, the civil societies. You got to bring them in, because not only are we talking about the producers or the creators of data and information, we're talking about the consumers and the users. Many times consumers and users are also producers. So we need to understand that in a national context. And then finally, we have that action plan, whatever that some countries have a format, others, it's just, they just adopt whatever that is suggested. Now, basically, the action plan allow us to actually work through very methodically this approach and to help us to actually look at where we are, where we want to be, and what we need to get from here. Now, the approach that we actually piloted with the 6 countries, it's done almost entirely remotely. But like what Greg mentioned, we have developed a series of resource materials that is available to the countries. And one of the things we have learned is that we also need to have some resource at the other end of the line. And you all may not know, but there's this movie that I always remember called the Ghostbusters. Who do you call? So these days, you don't need to pick up the phone. You just, can I have a Zoom meeting with you? Can I just clarify that with you? We found that very helpful to countries. Is that, and this is where, going back on the broader picture, something that why we are here this week, engaging with ICAs, we want a broader discussion, because who do you call? There need to be a lot of resources, that is available. There need to be a lot of expertise. All right, feature extraction. I don't know the technicality of it, but there must be an expert somewhere that we can actually call and provide some answers. So a little bit more of the approach that we are doing. We basically do it methodically. There is a method to it. I don't like the word method, but I call it an approach. But it is basically a way of helping countries, firstly, to have a shared understanding, of what the IGF can do for my country. You then have to have a collective commitment to move forward together. For some countries, that they achieve it in a number of months. For others, it takes a long time to come to that shared understanding. And then a commitment that will work together to develop a country-level action plan. And then there is a lot of, we love this because we are in a data space. There's a lot of, in assessing and analyzing, there's a lot of data collection, a lot of, workshopping, and then trying to understand needs, gaps, where we are at, what other countries are doing, what can we have, what can we not have, what are the resources. So you do a lot of this. And basically, again, it's about a collective understanding nationally, collective understanding of what we desire, or what is the desired future we want. And then finally, we all sit together, we discuss, we begin to design and put together and agree, very important, agree that this is the actions. Greg talked about the 133 member states that we engage. The process is similar. We need to sit together, we need to agree. I again mentioned to colleagues from UAE just now is that the IGIF is a consensus document because we subject it to such wide and broad global consultation among member states. The extremes are left out. This is what we, 193 member states of the United Nations, can agree collectively. That's why it is so useful in that sense, and that's what we have found. And along the way, we have developed a series of resources. As you can see here, we suggest part of that methodical approach. that, you begin by having some awareness raising, some initial assessment, then identify who are your stakeholders. And then in assessing, you do a series of exercises together, and then you basically come up with your needs assessment and gap analysis report. Let me just exit this and to go to the files. Sorry, Greg. Oh, this desktop. Yeah. No, this one. Okay, just to illustrate the resource materials we have developed. So this is one on the first part. So, again, the resource materials is developed for countries that needed something to help them to initiate a process. We are always saying this: if a country knows what to do, proceed. You proceed with your own awareness raising. You proceed with your own process. But for a number of countries, they say, well, where do I start? Can you just help me? And so we develop these materials to help them to have a practical starting point. Some will take this and just change it and modify it to their country context. Others will look at it and say, oh, is that how you're going to do it? Okay, I'm going to develop my own stakeholder analysis, all right, process it. And so it can be used many ways. So here, if you do not know how to start, we suggest this. There's a purpose to this. There's a method. Then we talk about identifying categories of stakeholders. Like, there's a bullet here that's empty because in your country, you may have a few more categories you want to add, or there's a few you want to subtract from this list. This is not the list. It's just to help you to have a think what you should be considering when you're looking at stakeholder categories. Then we suggest that you list them down and you do an analysis, and then you come up with a matrix. Okay. Now, if you know of a better way, please proceed. Better way, like I say, these are just practical starting points. So that's another resource that we have developed. Countries came to us and says, well, we have done all these analysis assessments. How do we actually put together a gap analysis assessment? Okay, if you do not know how, again, have a look at this. Again, this is just to help countries along. And then we suggest, and this is aligned to the 9 strategic pathways. So together, what are the elements? What is your current situation? What's the desired future? Assess the gaps and the possible strategies. When countries come to this stage, they're beginning to have an understanding of what they desire, what are the needs, what are the gaps, and what are some possible strategies they can implement. They continue to discuss this. So these are just some of the resource materials. We have resource materials. For example, again, you see under assessing and analyzing current and desired situation assessment, we develop a simple survey where, against the 8 goals, you can do a workshop. Some countries one of the 6 countries that we work with, they actually did a national workshop. They bring some stakeholders in and they say, okay, now this is a survey form that we can actually do. We can assess ourselves. Against this statement, is our national mapping, current, of our maps current, for example. And then in this is, okay, where it is now? Are we good, bad, or ugly? And then what is the future? So you can do all kinds of this assessment. And so we actually provide some guidance, some resource if, again, and I repeat, if you do not know how to start, the resources are there for you to start. Okay. Presently, we have, through some foundation, a project that has just started. It's called the Sdg Data Alliance, as you can see. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative, the spirit of SDG 17 partnership. And here, you know, we one of the focus of the partners, especially the foundation, is on equity, on SDG 10. But we have the chance here to actually help, again, countries who are willing to actually partner with us to measure their progress by ensuring that they have the data, geo-enabled data for the SDGs. So the Alliance has initiated support for an initial group of countries. As you can see, there are 11 countries. You'll notice that 3 of the countries there are using a development account project, because we are using the Sdg Data Alliance to now assist these countries to actually go into the next stage of their action, is to actually implement the action plan. One of the things that we say is that what was developed, the outcome of it is an action plan. It is a plan. It is not a national geospatial program. The action plan needs to be implemented. So to start to actually transform our national geospatial information arrangements for the better, we need a plan. And then we need to implement that plan. That plan, if you look at the elements, has the elements in there, including scheduling, priorities, resources that you need, what actions is to be taken, when, and by who. So it's all that plan. Then we need to implement. And on this list, if you look at it, it says, well, there are 3 countries that were similar to the first list you have, because we are using the resources made available by the partners of the Sdg Data Alliance to help these countries and to help us, all of us, learn about the aspects of implementing the action plan. By the way, the Sdg Data Alliance has the capacity to support up to 30 countries. This is just the first 11. Earlier, there were some discussions about the first session, and there were some discussions, and I pick up among a couple of things, talking about alignment, talking about transfer of knowledge. So I just put up this slide put up by our colleagues from the Ethiopian Geospatial Institute, who is one of the 6 countries we work with, and they are close to having their country-level action plan. They went through the approach that we have suggested. Methodically, they went through, they did a number of stakeholder engagement workshops. Tim and I had the privilege to be there in one of their earlier workshops when they were starting the process. And I understand they had one recently, despite challenges of a pandemic. So you could see, one of the things they did was they were able to align their geospatial information management with their national strategic drivers. And you can see on the right here, this is what is important to Ethiopia. And at the same time, it says we need to also align our organization, right, to be able to deliver. So one of the things they highlighted is that they never had a policy and legal directorate. They needed one now, go forward. And because of the work, the 9 pathways they went through, and they see what they have, and they say, look, this is important. The policy and legal aspects is really very important. It's something that's missing, and we need to pay attention to it. And so they, in their own organization, as part of their alignment, They actually now have a policy and legal framework directorate. As you can see, they also have capacity development, they have geospatial data, so a number of elements already in place. So it is, again, what we say about countries. They're using the IGF to strengthen their existing institutions or geospatial information management or their national arrangements. And this only came out recently because they went through that approach and they were able to methodically analyze their situation and understand, and looking at the guidance and the recommended actions, they decided that this is what we, Ethiopia, need to go forward. And the other one that is mentioned by Greg is Mongolia. I just put up a few pages. They have a strategy, they have a plan. Mongolia had an NSDI. And for a while, they were, struggling is not the right word. I'm trying to find a better word. They needed a lot of, they needed better political buy-in. And then when the IGF came along, they were able to strengthen their NSDI, leveraging the IGIF. And today, as my understanding is that this plan is before their cabinet. They also have a geospatial strategy. But if you look at it, you look at the vision. They have a vision, they have a mission. And if you look at it, you may want to say the language there, it sounds reads similar. That's what we meant. Just take whatever you have from the IGIF, repurpose it, reword it as is appropriate to your national situation. Use it. Words are there to be used. And so they have a vision, there's a mission, they have a strategic alignment. That's one of the things we are learning from our countries. It's so important. IGF talks about it. We need to be aligned to our national development priorities. So they have strategic alignment. If you look at their sector, land administration, mining, defense, principles, their goals, their benefits, and their action plan, it goes on. Now, just in closing, the approach that we are recommending to countries is something that countries can pick up, go about on their own. It's self-paced. Countries learn and discover. There is an element of capacity and capability development. Basically, is what it is existing today, all the investments you have, all the work you have done, do not throw it out. Build upon it. Okay? Nothing is wasted. Perhaps only sometimes we need to do things a little bit better, but nothing is, just keep building on it. So the approach we have is that, and that's why we talk about an element of capacity and capability development will come in. Some countries have chosen to partner with other countries to make it happen or to realize some aspects of their development. It's methodical, it's incremental, it's progressive. It just keeps building. And the work we have with the country is that we support them remotely through virtual training workshops. There's access to resource materials and access to subject matter expertise. Now, and that is where perhaps in the ICA, we need to have a think about some of this. How we can actually be part of helping countries make this happen and to realize that transformation is needed. So thank you.
To you. And so we have just fed you a tremendous amount of information. It's a lot of detail. I'm sure you must have some questions that you pursue. So please, anyone in the audience here before us have any questions for Tio or joining these two together? One, they were sequential, they follow one another. It's the order in which. Any questions? Yes, please, Francois.
Thanks. Thank you for this presentation. I have just a question about the support that you mean. This is a financial support, or what do you do to help on financial problem? Do you provide money? What do you do exactly?
So right now, the support that we are bringing to these countries, that's a very good question. I missed that. The support we're bringing to this country is what we would term technical, subject matter expertise, resource materials. One of the things that all these countries have agreed to actually journey with us and partner with us in this to develop their action plan, also need to actually have available resources, especially human resources, and some funding, because if you want to conduct a national workshop, sometimes you need to pay for coffee and tea. There needs to be some money. And we know agencies, sometimes if we did not plan for this 2 years ahead, we don't have a budget for it. There is some support under the 2 projects that we have showed you for countries to be able to hold in-country workshop. But those are, I'll tell you, it's available, but it's not easy to access. I'm sorry, but it's just the way it is. The support is primarily technical. And countries match that by having their own resources. Now, in our estimation, some countries are able to do it with their existing staff time and whatever allocations they have for their agency or their work. Others, they try 2 countries have actually reached out to other UN agencies that do have some of this development support in country, like the UNDP, and ask them to assist them, support their national workshop. So part of this learning and discovering and a capacity development approach is this. They learn all these things. They learn how to submit a proposal to an agency or to a national aid. Let's say there is a development agency from a country that there is some resources available to help them a workshop. They learn how to write a proposal and to submit it. Why do you want to do this? And that's what I meant by capacity and capability development. But I know I answered your question in a long-winded way, but essentially our support is technical.
So maybe interject another perspective in addition to what Tio just said. So, and he's going to correct me if I get this wrong, because he will correct me if I get this wrong. Yeah. In general, the UN doesn't provide a lot of direct support for these kinds of things. But in this particular case, we were proving in this 3rd part of the IGIF. And we really needed to see whether the country level action plans were going to work, because we had all these ideas, but on the ground, was it actually going to take off? And we had to test some of these ideas. And as we provided that technical support, a couple things happened. One, the engagement with different countries, the island states, the landlocked states, the least developed countries, each one of those groupings informed us, educated us about special things that we needed to account for in the planning and training and technical details in giving back to them. So there was a 2-way learning process going on there. One observation that we would make from that engagement with them is they had to come to the table with, in a sense, in-kind contributions, and that was really from a staffing level. So those teams were formed up. We required them to have teams. What we observed over time were a number of factors. One is that the teams tended to grow. So they expanded their interest locally to ensure that they were going to be able to accomplish what it is that they set out to do. Secondly, they tended, and this is just an observation, a personal observation, but they also tended to bring in newer or younger staff who were technically qualified in a particular topic that as we were getting into more details. So they benefited by that exchange, and all of that added to the sustainability of that country's capability for keeping the process moving and learning and engaging. So that was really important. Another thing that happened in this process was that because of the time period, it lasted for quite a while, the leadership of the teams more often than not also changed. So they would be called off to do other things. The leader and another person from the team would be elevated up to take over and be the main point of contact. So there was a lot of engagement and a lot of transition just within this process. But at the end of the day, I would suggest that it was all positive. In other words, it was not something that ended up putting the project in jeopardy or the effort in jeopardy. It was actually quite the opposite. It was something that sustained it. The second point I would make is that in terms of your question, the support, it's clear that these countries that are in developing circumstances they don't have the resources to do all of this on their own. And so now we're into a different phase where, an alliance of benefactors are actually providing some help. This includes guidance from the UN, but the benefactors are the ones that are really footing the bill. They're actually paying the fee. So that's what we really want to see happen. We want to see that this is a process that other benefactors will subscribe to. And one of the things that we do in this process of the country level action plan is that we actually identify when we talk about these gaps and other things that a country, may need to fill in what's required to have a geospatial information management environment. That provides an opportunity for a donor country, a private sector company, a non-government organization, another UN agency, to say, hey, we can give you support there. This is something that we are interested in doing, and we'll provide the support necessary for you to do that thing, that action. So, we're just at the beginning of understanding how this all works, but clearly it's already starting to have a positive impact in terms of that overall development and support. So I don't know if we answered your question, but just to give you some information. Thanks. Oh, did you want to say?
I guess my comment was kind of carrying on from the comment with Claire this morning is it's a bit like whether this glass is 1/3 full or 1/3 or 2/3 empty. It's really how you look at it. And so one of the I guess the advantages of this journey with the countries is that they've taken their need out of their individual silo. They've taken their need from this is what I need at my Geospatial Institute into this is the need of the nation. So it's become more engaging at a political level and at a national level. So that value proposition has excelled a lot. So it often, at the very start, countries were saying, well, I'm not going to get the money. I don't have resources. I don't have staff. And you can keep complaining about that, or you could do something about it. And this is really about these countries doing something about it. And they are really doing that. So they're now more engaged with higher levels and higher officials in government. And that's now changing someone's thinking. And the other side of that coin too, just to use Mongolia as an example, and the Data Alliance, as Tim said, is that if philanthropy and international donors can see value and benefit in something that's tangible and that could work, that changes the whole thinking as well. And we're starting to see that now with some of these partnerships that are being formed. We could have had these discussions 5-6 years ago and it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But now there's kind of like, oh, I get it. And Mongolia is a good example of that. They've put this strategy together. And when we developed the IGIF overarching strategy originally, we actually did this in partnership with the World Bank. And part of that process for the World Bank was saying, how do we then provide loans to countries? Those loans to countries are not on geospatial. They're on the economy or transformation or land or other aspects. And so Mongolia is using their transformation agenda, their program, and now working with the World Bank for a loaning package that includes their whole digital transformation and e-commerce, but underpinned on that is the geospatial aspect. So it becomes a more inclusive process, and that's how it should be. It's like if you're a small silo in a big organization, I mean, of government, it's very difficult to get the attention and the resources. But if you make your relevance known and your role and applicability known, it becomes not easy, but a lot easier than it used to be. And I think that's what we're learning a lot now in some of the countries, is that, you move yourself up in that value chain is really important.
One of the, I wouldn't say discover, it was very gratifying to actually discover for us. And we put together the IGIF initially, the 3 parts. And as we work with countries to develop the action plan. And there is actually, you notice in the approach we have, the first part is a plan of action. That's a plan to develop your country level action plan. Then the country level action plan helps you to implement the IGIF, which is a bit longer time. So we learn and we discover together with the countries that you do need a plan. I mean, maybe all of us in the room said, yeah, of course, nobody's going to give you any budget or any support without a plan. But interestingly, many of us needs to actually discover that. And so now we have a plan to develop a country level action plan. And there are some agencies who are prepared to support that. It's not a lot of money. 20,000 US, and they're supporting it. Okay, we're helping you on that. And then once they have a country level action plan, they can see, this is where transformation is going to happen. This is the actions. And there is, in some part, not in every part, there is a dollar sign to it that, okay, we can talk. So what Greg says, so in Mongolia's case, let's talk. The World Bank is thinking of supporting the Mongolian government for their digital government initiative. But they have a geospatial component in there. And because they have an action plan, that it can be. So it's a concept of, we need a plan that's bankable. If you're in business, all right, I need a plan, a business plan. And so countries are now able to do that. And then they're using the IGIF as the mechanism for the transformation that the country needs. I hope that makes sense. I know, as I said, it's a lot of explanation.
So are there other questions that folks may have? And online as well, if there are questions for online, please ask.
This is, sorry, from Claire Hadley. Okay, sorry. In answer to David Ford's question, how the Zambia work was funded, it was part funded by the Ordnance Survey, so we could test our capabilities, and part funded by the International Growth Center, which is working with UN Habitat.
So, I mean, that's an example of how you have a national government and a UN agency and an NGO associated with the UN agency contributing to the process. And those are very different organizations. I mean, when you stop and think about it, but that means that there was collaboration going on, similar to what's happening with the Sdg Data Alliance. You've got an NGO, you've got private sector, you've got government. Yeah, so I mean, these kinds of things are, if they make the effort to make these collaborations work, then there are real benefits realized from those that are on the receiving end of that of the assistance. But you know, from my point of view, being involved in support to developing countries for a long time, I constantly push on the notion of the sustainability. It's much, much better if countries do the work themselves than if they have the work done by somebody else. And so in the case of Zambia, for example, that to me was an issue of technology and process and testing in a pilot context. But that process is going to be turned back over to Zambia for them then to take it to the next level and to take it to a greater exposure within the country. So you have greater use of that approach. Every time you have someone that's going through the pain and difficulty of making mistakes and learning and seeing good outcomes from the effort that they put in, that all builds sustainability. You will not forget that experience, and that's what's so valuable to a country. So it's better that they do the work themselves. Like in the case of this DA11 project that Tio referenced, the work was not provided by the experts. The work was provided by the countries. They did the work. Guidance was provided by the experts. Do this, don't do that, because we've been down that path before and it doesn't work. So it saves them time, resources, frustration, failure. So that's the kind of help that allows them to continue them moving down the path and gaining support. Okay, any other questions? Fine, any questions? Oh, yes, Mark, please.
So you've mentioned some of the kind of lessons learned from the countries. I'm curious, if there's any others, but also how is that going to come back to the other? You've worked with 6 different countries now. How's it going to come back to the other 24, or hopefully even more than that? Is there a formal way of collecting that lessons learned that can help the other countries?
Is asking about lessons learned. So for the experiences of the 6, is that really 30 now, the next hopper?
So the other motivation of including 3 of the 6 in the first group, Sdg Data Alliance, is one of the things when it sounds so wrong, especially coming from the UN, is this, when countries approach us for support, and we give because they are our member states. But we say it would be really very good if you could also help us in a way that you also become a reference. And so we recently, you notice that the group of 11 has a significant number of African countries because we work with our regional committee for Africa. And in the process, they actually have articulated a number of expectations for countries who put up their hands to be the first group. For one, the last expectation is you must be a lighthouse for the rest of Africa. So the expectation is as you journey along, we're all part of this learning and discovery. You become a reference, your lessons learned. And that's what Tim says. You can be the other end of the phone call, okay? And says, now we are thinking of a course network that is going to be 15 kilometers apart. I mean, is that insanity or is that clever? They will tell you, the expert there will tell, hang on. Why do you need, a course network with 15 kilometer stations every 15 kilometers apart? I mean, that is insanity. Okay, we are hearing. Now tell me why. So we are learning and we are discovering together. That is actually the intention of the approach we're doing. And so when Africa talk among themselves, came up with 6 countries, it says, we agree, but one of the things, you have to be a lighthouse for the rest of us in Africa.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
great. Thank you, Tio.
And what I would also add to that is that in the case of the 6 countries, they were all different. I mean, there are different countries, obviously, but the end of the day, their country level action plans were all different. And the reason for that, and it's something that we impressed upon them throughout the whole process, is it reflected what their national priorities were and their national circumstances. The other thing that happens is that they went through a different process of prioritization. So, for example, if of the 9 strategic pathways, some chose, as Greg indicated before, governance is critical. So governance goes without saying. Everybody has to deal with governance. Some had no legal or policy place, but they knew that that was important to them, so they had a little bit of a focus on that, or a lot of focus on that. Others may have already had, authorization, and they weren't really going to pursue that at the moment. So they all had different priorities of the different strategic pathways. Because the other reality is that you cannot, I mean, this is me talking, but you cannot do all 9 and be successful at the same time. It's just too much work. There's no way you can get all that done. So you either, focus on certain ones or pieces of certain ones, so that you're doing what you need to meet those national circumstances, those national priorities. And the other reality was, and this is the reality of life, at least 3 of the countries had changes in administration while we were there. So they had elections, and a whole new crew comes in, and the priorities were now different. And so how does the geospatial community respond to that? And so one of the things that we suggested to them as an example was on the communication, SP9, have an off-the-shelf update, a briefing document that says who you are, what you do, why it's important to your country, so that you can brief whoever you need to in the new administration so that they know who you are. Going back to Mongolia, Mongolia had a very unique situation, and this was informative. They were able to align with their minister really early in the process, and their minister supported them all the way through. And when they were showing that they were actually going to get this done, their country level action plan, it went right up to the national leadership. The national leadership said, yep, we're going to do this, and now you have to deliver. So it really turned that upside down on them. And that was a good thing, but it was also a pressure point, because now they had to figure out, okay, how am I going to implement? Because remember that the plan that we're talking about in this context, this is the plan. It's not the implementation of it. The implementation is a whole separate activity. And this is where you get into, basic project management. Who's going to do what, when, how long is it going to take, and how you're going to track it, where exactly it's resource intensive.
Where's the priorities? Which one comes before?
So that's the next phase. And these countries are at that kind of transition point now between country level action plan and now how they're going to begin to implement. And this is again where, without resources, and I'm talking about financial resources in this case more than anything else, this is where in some cases they're going to need some help to get to that next phase. But these are also opportunities for donor nations, donor groups, philanthropy, whatever is required. Now they have a document that says, I need help here, I need help there. If we're going to see improved agricultural processes, here's what we need to do that, whatever it is. So I think that this is hardcore stuff. It's working, and we'll see how it all plays out. So other
Good,
questions?
thank you.
Sorry, go ahead. No,
No,
please.
it's good. Thank you.
Other questions? So, I mean, think about it in your own country context. How would you see this, being beneficial in your country context? Are you overwhelmed to a point where you don't even know where to begin with this, or do you see this it's not fitting really well with where you are or what you want to do? Or is this something that you like to explore further and just would like to understand it better? And, how might that happen? What's your reaction to what you've been hearing in this context? Question? Yes, please.
Yeah, well, this is International Mapping Agency of Latvia. Yeah. And why I'm here? Because we, in your country, every 7 years, we made a document, geospatial information development concept. And of course, next year we have plans to update this concept. We want to, this new concept, put things from this international experience, of course, of United Nations, this is geospatial information management. And I hope we are on the right way. We are not more along, I think at least 20 years that we are not developing country, and I think these things is very important and useful for all countries. Yes, thank you. And for me, is more or less clear this, and we will implement some things of this in our organizations. And yeah, and when in Latvia we have this spatial data infrastructure, of course. Yeah, and before we more in previous we focused on implementation on Inspire, and but now I think with Inspire is more or less okay. Then we more focus what happens in all world. That is comment. Yeah, it's how I feel and how our plans were got. Probably we will. For 5 years, I will report how are things about the development of national spatial infrastructure and geospatial information. Yeah, because we're going to this more in deep in this digital transformation and so on. So these things are not new for us. Okay, thank you. Probably somebody wants to tell more.
Yeah, thank you. If I can maybe just sort of make some additional comments on that as well, and very much where we're seeing even just at some of the highest levels where countries are just really making an alignment. They're basically aligning now their national SDI or even their national geospatial strategies to the IGIF. And a really simple example of this, which is a good one, is, and Claire's online, is the Geospatial Commission of the UK has basically, they've made an alignment with the IGIF and their strategy, and a number of countries are now doing that, including my own country in Australia. But further to that, and it wasn't something we sort of saw coming as quickly, is that there's a number of, I guess, parts of our industry and sector that are also aligning to the IGIF. And further to that, we've got a number of areas, and we didn't show these slides per se, is that within that overarching group of strategies that I spoke about with the global geospatial strategies, such as that included land administration and marine, etc. So what has actually happened is the framework for effective land administration under the land administration expert group has now aligned itself completely to the 9 strategic pathways of the IGIF. The Marine Geospatial Working Group is doing the same. The Geodesy subcommittee is looking at how it can leverage it in the same way as is our working group on disasters. So we're seeing these different thematic areas and these different approaches also now aligning to the IGIF. And it's it sort of comes back a little bit to that slide I had with the benefits, and they had sort of this different series of green boxes where we have those societal benefits, but there's also those thematic benefits. And when you look at land administration, in this case, land, marine, disasters, etc., we're starting to see this alignment with the IGIF because it just seems to be so practical and logical. So, and that's taking place across a number of sectors. And I guess one of the things for consideration in the future too is that it may not necessarily be even line geospatial agencies that use elements of the IGIF. You know, other government agencies in other areas, whether it's in the environment or water or other areas, agriculture within government, that may also start thinking about some of those aspects too, I would suspect.
And if I could add to that, I mean, one of the things that is a kind of a derivative of all this work is that, in effect, the IGIF is the next rendition of the NSDI, because the more traditional responsibilities of national mapping agencies have been well defined, but within certain limits, and you didn't extend beyond those limits. Now, with all this other data coming in and the expectations of user communities and leadership of government saying, why can't we do this? And what's the answer to that? And the only way you're going to be able to do that or get that answer is to be having a dialogue with other organizations within government, maybe the private sector, maybe it's the academic area. And this is where the collaboration then now expands your responsibilities. And this is one of the reasons why in the strategic pathways that we have enumerated, you have one on financial. There is nothing about geospatial that doesn't cost money. And if you're expanding your responsibilities and your network of activities, it's not going to be done with the same amount of money that's been allocated to basically produce a 1 to 50,000 scale topo sheet. You got to go beyond that. And so where's that coming from? So that's why we say that you need to be thinking about these things as you go. The other thing that I think is a good observation is that generally there's a disconnect, I think, between the academic offerings in preparing people for work in the new environment from those that are existing, particularly in developing countries. There's a real either the absence of or a disconnect between kind of where this is going. So that needs to change. And how is that going to happen? And so that's where, for example, we're the ICA. We have a lot of smart people here. We should be developing capability, information, tools, whatever it may be, to help share in that experience so that others that may not be exposed to this can now be part of that educational engagement. And it doesn't have to be only at a university level. These could be worker training workshops. It could be a whole host of things. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Workforce training. So these are the kinds of things that I think in the context of, academic programs, if you've got a course in NSDI, it's time to make a change. And the beauty is the material's already done. The information's already done. The implementation guide, those 9 strategic pathways, each chapter, there's enough information there to build many courses if you need to go down that path. So, this is a movement in a sense. It's a work in progress, but it's a movement, and I think there's lots of opportunity there.
Tim, could I?
Yeah, please.
Could I just, echoing what you're saying, I think you're absolutely right. The role of national mapping and geospatial authorities, cadastral authorities is changing. It's evolving. Probably the best way to think about it. But it's evolving much more quickly than it ever has. As a community, many of you go back 100, 200 more years. If you look back, you've always innovated. You've always leveraged technology through the years. So this is not a big change. I think it's just happening faster than it's happened in the past. Last thing I'll say is, I think the integrated geospatial information framework, the IGIF, is definitely the next generation of evolution of SDI. And I'll just echo that with, been having conversations with my boss, Jack Dangerman, and Dean Angelides when we were preparing for the Cambridge Conference conversations in September, which were leading to the COP26 input from our community, from our national mapping and geospatial community to the COP26 on climate change. So we were talking with Jack Dangerman and Dean Angelides about this. And Jack really sees this community as being fundamental to implementing, to being successful. We've never really recognized all of the benefits that we envisioned for SDI. This has been going on since 1993. IGIF is our opportunity to really be able to get to those realization of those benefits. So that's not just for me, that's coming from Jack Dangerman. So
Thanks, Mark.
I think you will hear, even from yesterday, Greg's keynote presentation earlier today. It is about integrating geospatial information, data information, with any other meaningful data, solve issues and challenges related to our lives and our livelihoods. That's what the IGIF is there. That's why it's transformational. It is about integrating. We no longer operate in silos. Maps that we produce has a purpose. It's going to be integrated with any other meaningful data to solve, I say, the issues and the challenges we all face together now for our lives and our livelihoods, basically. And that is the IGIF.
Other observations, questions, reactions, concerns, points you would like to make? Online as well? All right, if that's the case, what I would suggest is that we break now for lunch. That's possible. So it's just after 1 o'clock, 1:05, but we'll be back here at 2:45. That's the plan. So we would have normally taken an hour and a half. We're going to just take a few minutes more. So we'll be back here at 2:45 to continue the discussions. And at that point, it is going to be largely discussion. So please come back with your ideas and your questions, your reaction, and please tell us. You're all wet. This doesn't make any sense. I'm lost. Tell us so that we can learn from that and make it better. That's the goal. And then the other side is I am very interested in hearing your thoughts about how the ICA can support these efforts. So we are supporting them, but how, from your perspective, how can the ICA do more to support these efforts? So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that. So with that, we'll stop now for a lunch break, and we'll be back at 2:45. So that's about an hour and a half for those people online. Okay? Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.